Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club, where we're discussing Saint Augustine's City of God, selections and introduction by Hans Urs von Balthasar. Vivian is alone there at Ignatius Press. Joseph alone there in South Carolina, and I am alone here in the sunny, sweaty, humid state of Florida at beautiful Ave Maria University, where I reconcile with Tom Monahan, or he with me, and I've seen some of these wonderful students here, extraordinary, and it's going to, I believe, realize the dream which Tom originally had once he finally realized that I was right about the size of the university. So we were having a discussion before we went live here, and Vivian was making a typically brilliant remark, and I stopped her, exercising my patriarchal authority. I said, say that, please say that on camera. So Vivian, I turn it over to you.
Okay, well, today we're going to discuss the chapter Rome as an image of the earthly city. And it's helpful sometimes to refer back to an author's own words about what he's doing. And if you go back to the prologue, Augustine points out that he is defending the most glorious city of God and so on, against her critics. And then a little while down, this is on page 47, by the way, and then a little farther down, for I know very well what efforts are needed to persuade the proud how great the power of humility is. So this chapter, Rome as an image of the earthly city, which begins on 181, what Augustine is doing here is defending the city of God against the critics in the Roman Empire who are blaming the decline of the empire on the Christians. That's basically what he's doing in this chapter by saying, well, now, wait a minute. If we just look at the history of Rome and we look at its, dark underbelly and its vices and so on, we're going to see that you can't very well blame the decline of the empire on Christianity. There's plenty of faults in Rome itself that are worth looking at. And that's kind of what he's doing in this chapter, at the same time that he praises the Romans for the natural virtues they did have. Anyway, so it helped me to kind of think about what is he trying to do here? And I think that's what he's doing.
We will not have to make a similar defense. No one is ever going to accuse the Catholic Church of causing the decline of the United States of America. They might have accused us of things in the 19th century, and even the 18th century to some extent. But I haven't seen anybody assigning blame for our present decline to Christianity.
Quite clearly, it's the rejection of it, which is the reason for the decline.
Exactly.
I think even the atheists can see that, I think.
And, in this chapter, once again, the brilliance of Augustine is evident because he's not just a bishop or even an orator. He knows history and philosophy. He goes through these various philosophers very carefully. And as we'll see, he doesn't condemn them outright. In fact, he respects what's good in them. But he, with his tremendous awareness of what God has revealed to us as truth, and with his tremendous native powers of intellect, he is able to look at things which are not part of the church or predate the church and see what's good in them and where they went wrong. It's just watching how he does this, I think, is a fascinating lesson for us. I have a quote on the first page. Do you, Joseph?
I want to read the entire first paragraph.
Well, go ahead.
So basically, this chapter begins, I think, with just a brilliant paragraph by Augustine. So I would have it understood that what I have said about Rome's people and republic, I also say and maintain about those of the Athenians and any other Greeks, about those of the Egyptians, about the former Babylon of the Assyrians, and about those of any other people when they exercised imperial rule, great or small, in their republics. For in general, the city of the ungodly is not ruled by God and is not obedient to him in offering sacrifice only to him. And in that city, as a consequence, the soul does not rightly and faithfully rule the body, nor does reason the vices, and so it lacks true justice. So two things I want to say about that, actually. First of all, is how Augustine shows us here a perennial truth about political philosophy, that empires basically have the same characteristics. And of course, he's not able to look to the future. He looks to the past, but we can look to Augustine's future and see that those same sort of problems that he sees in the empires of the past are true, for instance, in the British Empire and in Holy Roman Empire and the expansion of France and, of course, the expansion of Islam. So empires in the future exhibit these same factors. And then the other thing I want to talk about is how that brilliant final part there, where he basically says that the earthly city, the city of the ungodly, because it's not ruled by God, nor is it obedient to him, nor does it offer sacrifice to him, that's a direct consequence of that. The soul does not rightly and faithfully rule the body. In other words, the body rules the soul, nor does reason the vices. In other words, viciousness destroys reason, and so it lacks true justice. And the consequence of that lack of reason, that lack of virtue, and that lack of self-sacrifice is the lack of justice. And again, if you really want to see what's happening in, you mentioned the United States, Father, what's happening in the modern woke world at the moment, it's a direct, basically coming together again of what Saint Augustine saw in the last days of Rome.
In this paragraph which you read and which I also underlined, it seems as if he's talking about individual souls ruling individual bodies. He's talking about the city of the ungodly, but he says in that city, as a consequence, the soul does not rightly and faithfully rule the body, nor does reason the vices. And so it lacks true justice. So, but he seems to be saying that if individuals don't have right order in their souls, then the city itself lacks true justice. As if to say, I guess he is saying that no matter what you do in your political order, no matter what rules you put into office, whatever your structure is, if the members of that city are not virtuous, then you do not have a just city. And that's a pretty impressive, statement he's making there.
Yeah, and basically if viciousness, or another word for it, pride, becomes the norm, all justice disappears and you end up with tyranny. It's as simple as that. And of course, we now live in a system where pride is the norm and it's boasted about.
And our own founders of the United States said the exact same thing. They said that without virtue, the republic will not last. And, here's a republic if you can keep it. There were all of these warnings that, if the people stop lives of true worship, even though they didn't specify what that was, they sort of knew what that was, and virtue, well, there goes your society. And Augustine alluded to that in previous chapters that, these tendencies, unfortunately, are at work when people become proud, affluent, corrupt. Even good societies rot.
Yeah, and in that quote you read, Joseph, he does say, for in general, the city of the ungodly is not ruled by God. It's not obedient. And then the following paragraph, after where you stop, for no matter how laudably the soul may appear to rule the body and reason the vices. So even if the soul might be ruling the body and the individuals, if the soul and reason do not themselves serve God, so it's not enough that you control your passions and you're living a rational life. That's got to be ordered to God. As God himself has taught that he should be served, they do not rule the body and the soul vices rightly at all. What kind of ruler of the body and of the vices can the mind be if it does not know the true God, and instead of being subject to his rule, is prostituted to the corrupting influence of the most vicious demons? I mean, this is
what he's really saying is that natural virtue, that's being, if you like, informed by natural reason and philosophy such as Stoicism, is not sustainable. That ultimately, without grace, just having a graceless reason, a reason without God, is not actually going to lead to justice or to virtue in the long term.
And one reason for that on 182 is because sometimes people with natural virtue, through their own efforts, what happens? They get puffed up and proud. And so they are not to be counted as virtues, but rather as vices. So even, pride will corrupt even natural virtue if it becomes a source of pride. And so he now, through the whole rest of this chapter, you can see this tension where he admires the manly virtues of Rome, and yet at the same time sees that when pride is sort of the root of it, that it can't help but fall. And so, like the very next section now about, let us then consider the moral qualities of the Romans and see why the true God, in whose power earthly kingdoms are also included, deign to help them. I mean, he even sees divine providence at work in the creation of the Roman Republic, which is astonishing. But, pride goes before a fall.
Yeah, if I may say something here, though, I think I sort of was almost rolling my eyes at the tempted to call glib patriotism of Saint Augustine as a Roman here, but I think what's happening, of course, his audience is a Roman audience, and in the art of rhetoric, he doesn't want to lose his audience. So of course he's leaning over backwards to say all the good things about Rome, about pagan Rome, and so that we understand, we acknowledge all of those good things, and then we get the but. Because for me, it reminded me a little bit with some of the stuff about patriotism, a little bit jingoistically, and I actually wrote Rupert Brooke down. If I should die, I think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. That sort of noble patriotism.
Well,
but I think that what he's doing is he wants to bring his audience with him. So he's being patriotic, and there's nothing wrong with being patriotic, but I think that leaning over backwards to be seen to be pro-Roman Empire.
I don't think this is mere salesmanship. I mean, he recognizes that the Pax Romana, that when God decided to enter human history, he came at a time when Judea was governed by Rome, and that all of the roads, all of the seaways by which the gospel was soon to be spread by the missionary activity of the first apostles and continuing, that by providence that was possible, and so I don't think it's simply salesmanship. Or rhetorical.
Well, I mean, God does write providentially, with crooked lines, write straight with crooked lines. What you've just said about the Roman Empire could be said about the Spanish Empire and the New World, or the British Empire and the Pax Britannica. So, it's absolutely true, of course, that God chooses the moment he enters history, and he enters the Roman Empire, and therefore it is the Roman Empire by which the gospel is spread. Thanks be to God. But I think you have to be a little bit careful when saying that's because of the Roman Empire. God chooses the Roman Empire, but doesn't make the Roman Empire virtuous the fact that God chooses to enter Judea.
It didn't make the Jews virtuous because he chose Israel either, or Abraham, But I think you're both right. I mean, Augustine is a rhetorician, and therefore he is going to render the audience benevolent. But I also think he truly loves Rome, recognized himself as a product of Rome, and saw the good that was there. And actually, to me, an example of this, bottom page 186, he's not about Cato. He says, it was therefore the virtue of only a few the few who strove for glory, honor, and power by the true way, that is by virtue itself, that Cato praised. So Cato praised true virtue. From their virtue came the diligence at home that Cato speaks of, the diligence that worked to enrich the public treasury and keep private fortunes slim. And so in contrast, he sets it down as a vice that when morals have been corrupted, now does this sound like anything contemporary? When morals have been corrupted, we find public impoverishment and private wealth, the so-called wealth gap.
Right,
you know?
right.
But again, he praises Cato for praising honor and virtue and true virtue, and praises Cato for recognizing that when true virtue is lost, then we have this corruption. By the way, that's one of the things that Ray Dalio says in his book about the rise and fall of empires, is that when you get to the later stages, you know, after the stages of growth and affluence, that the wealthy want to become more wealthy, they borrow more money to buy more things, and they impoverish the few, and you get this greater disparity of wealth, which then leads to social unrest. So I don't know what will happen as we get closer to that stage, but we're definitely closer to that stage than we were 40, 50 years ago.
And we've had these cycles before. Let's think about the Gilded Age, for example.
Yes.
And, you know, so the question is, can the society correct itself? You know, American society has corrected itself before. It got rid of slavery. It came up with antitrust laws to break up the trusts that owned up all this, gobbled up all this property, and the railroad barons, and all these things. I mean, we have righted the ship of state before. Can we do it again? I don't know.
That's right. And the Great Depression, 1929, and so on. That was after the Roaring '20s, right? And the Roaring '20s with high speculation. Again, it was that huge wealth gap. And so, I mean, I want to be a patriotic American, but I don't care if America disappears like other countries. You know, it's part of the world. The world's passing away. Nevertheless, we too, like Augustine, should recognize the blessings we've had to be in this country and hope that the coming catastrophe, if it does come, and I believe it is, will lead to a purification. And in fact, Ratzinger, in his wonderful book, Faith and the Future, if I've said this before on, remind me, I won't say it again, but he has a chapter called The Church of the Future. But what he's saying in that book is that the church is becoming smaller and smaller as the world becomes more worldly, but if it's faithful, it will be seen as home later when those who have, left the church, left Christianity, end up in solitude and despair. They'll find where their true home was. And so that will be the restoration. That will be the beginning of a new cycle, so to speak, politically.
Couldn't agree more.
Aquinas says that the reason why, and I don't want to make an appeal to an authority, I want to say it because I think it's true, that you love your country the way you love your parents, and that you realize you owe a debt of gratitude for your life and your well-being to both your parents and your country. Now that doesn't mean you become a, jingoistic, nativistic, whatever all these extremes are of boorishness.
The danger, I think, is if patriotism, if one's country becomes one's God, if you begin to idolize our nation as an end in itself, then there's a problem, because there has to be one nation under God, whichever nation. That's true of all nations. It has to be under God. And if it's not under God, there's the danger it becomes an idol. And at that point, you get all sorts of monstrous things being done in the name of patriotism. That's right. And America has been one of the most self-critical countries in all of human history, which is why we actually eradicated slavery. You can't have an abolition movement by people who just have love of country before everything else, So that ability to, like I say, self-criticism, which came out of Christianity, right? I mean, what argument do you have against slavery if you don't believe in God and don't believe that everyone is a child of God and therefore equal in the sight of God? I mean, if you don't have that, what's your argument against slavery, right?
And Joseph, help me on this, because Chesterton wrote some very good things in different places about patriotism. But there's one place somewhere, I don't remember where he talks about it's impossible to say why you love your country because there's too many things. It's the way the streets, are paved. It's the way the lighting system works. It's the way it's everything that all the little things in your life that you grew up with. Yeah.
Yep.
So he's covered Varro, Euhemerus, and Plato. He'll come back to Plato.
At great length in the next chapter. But in this chapter, he kind of goes through all of these great statesmen of Rome, Cato, as you mentioned, Cicero, Cincinnatus, and he, as you said, Father, he finds the good in each one, but he's not going to hold back from the criticism. And again, what is he doing? He's trying to explain to his Roman audience, look, you can't blame the fall of Rome on Christianity. Just take a look at the rise and fall of your empire on its own actions. You've become corrupt, and little wonder you've got the problems that you've got. That's basically what he's doing. But at the same time, he's praising what praise is due. And,
195, you said, Vivian, about the power and virtue of self-criticism in nations. You talked about specifically about the United States. But on page 195, he basically, there's a bit of self-criticism about Christians, not Christianity, of course, but Christians. So about 10 lines down on page 195, it says, talking about the virtuous pagans and their patriotism, they do this, after all, to obtain a place in the company of the angels, talking about the Christians, while those Romans did something very similar for no greater reason than to preserve the glory of Rome. If, for the sake of the most glorious city of God, we do not hold fast to the virtues of which they held to a kind of likeness, for the sake of no more than the glory of the earthly city, we shall be pierced with shame. If we talk about heaven and not Rome, right, and we can't be as virtuous as they are, then what does that say about us and our faith? Right?
It's like the parable in the Gospels of the shrewd steward, right? When he finds out that he's going to lose his job, and he quickly goes and changes the accounts of the people who owe debts to his master. And Jesus praises this man, saying, the worldly use cleverness to get ahead in the world. What are you Christian duffers doing? It's kind of what he's saying, right? And I underlined that too, Joseph, thinking of this parable of Jesus, right? I mean, if people will do this just for worldly glory, which is here today and gone tomorrow, how much more should the Christian who believes in God and the glory that lies in wait for him be willing to do?
Amen.
And just in general, as we move ahead here, and you said it, I think, at the beginning, Vivian, we're getting into some of the most profound central themes of Augustine's life and writing. So we're going to have a lot to discuss. And later on, we get to grace, for example. I mean, he's called the Doctor of Grace. So this is wonderful. I just think it's good for all of us to remember what we owe to Augustine and the way he expresses things and the way he's so practical about things. I didn't underline anything until page 228, so probably both of you have something before then.
Well, I have 202 next at the bottom. Vivian?
Well, I was just, it's like a crash course in Roman history. Like he mentions the Punic Wars, which on page 204, or 203, 204, which Chesterton in his
Everlasting
Man notes, well, thank God Rome won the Punic Wars. Thank God it wasn't Carthage that was victorious. And
he's got that chapter, The War of the Gods and the Demons, and talks about, can you imagine people with top hats going down the street to put the baby in the furnace, burn him?
Right. And yet at the same time, he mentions that there was some regret that Carthage was as brutally destroyed as it was by the Romans by the time they finally just said, the famous lines on the floor of the Senate, Carthage must be destroyed. And I don't think they left a rock on top of a rock by the time they were done, the Romans, that is. And so, this whole history is pretty messy. And yet you can stand back from it the way Augustine does, and Chesterton does too, and see, well, it's kind of a fortunate ththing that Rome, not Carthage, won that war.
That's right. Well, it's like you think of our whole history. Our whole history is kind of it's a very chancy thing. You got Thermopylae and Marathon. You know, we'd be speaking Persian otherwise. You got the Battle of Lepanto. We'd be speaking Arabic if that hadn't been won. I mean, we're pretty fortunate to be here at all. Speaking that beautiful English, you know. Well, anyway, that was good too. You have something, Joseph, on one of these pages?
Well, I just said at the bottom of 202, he's quoting, I don't know, I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, Sallust, the historian. Citizens were not, this is right at the bottom of page 202. Citizens were not called good or bad on the basis of worthwhile service to the Republic, for all were equally corrupt. Rather, whoever was the wealthiest and had the most power to do harm was counted as good, because he supported the existing state of affairs. And again, you know, we can look at those words about Rome, you know, almost 2,000 years ago and see it as a direct reflection of the sort of society in which we find ourselves today. This plutocracy where the rich are praised just for being rich and for conserving the status quo.
And so, interestingly enough, one of the outgrowths of Rome's victory over Carthage, look on page 205, that according to Sallust, this historian, you know, it was during this period that the Romans held to the highest moral standards and lived in greatest concord. Not long after that, Asiatic luxury, worse than any armed enemy, crept into Rome for the first time. In other words, the very victory that is praised and what we're grateful for was the very means by which Rome got all this wealth. Now they controlled the entire Mediterranean. They no longer had this naval rival of Carthage. Now they pretty much controlled the lanes of commerce for themselves, became incredibly wealthy, and then what did that do? Worse than any armed enemy, this Roman historian is saying, is this wealth that leads to corruption and
again, that's a pattern that repeats itself in other subsequent empires.
That's right. Their very victory and success becomes the cause of their downfall.
That's right. So let's not pray for too much success.
Not of that sort, anyway.
Yes.
At least when I'm gone, we can stop being Victorian. No, just kidding. I've got grandchildren I'm thinking of now, so
yes,
I'm not asking for justice to be rained down from heaven. I'm asking for mercy.
Yes. Oh, actually, when I mentioned 228, that's the next chapter. So why don't we conclude any remarks we have and finish it with this chapter? Well, not exactly a chapter, it's a section, but any other comments we should make on Rome as an image of the earthly city?
Well, I would like to point out 2008, where they begin to talk about those ruthless civil wars. So, you know, sometimes no sooner do you succeed against your external enemies, now you tear yourselves apart, right? And that succession of ruthless civil wars in Rome with, you know, one general after another wiping out the other and raising their own private armies against one another and tearing the country apart. I mean, that was the period just before the reign of Augustus, who brought at least a temporary peace.
But it was a great blessing for Elizabethan drama.
And that's what really counts. Just at the top page 210, I mean, if we had more time, I'd read it. But it's a whole top half the page. I don't need to do that. But it's very much reminiscent of Plato's Republic, the way his grasp of political philosophy here. The various types of government, you have ruled by a king, and then if the single king, if he becomes corrupt, he's a tyrant, or ruled by a clique or an elite, and if they become corrupt, it's a faction. Or ruled by the people, and if they become corrupt, he doesn't have a word for it here, but we might use the word the mob. But in all cases, what's lost is the common good. So again, we have that Augustine had this firm grasp of what we might call Platonic political philosophy there.
That's right. That Aristotle's Politics does exactly that. Looks at these three different kinds of rule and shows that each one of them can become corrupt. It's not like any one rule is guaranteed to preserve the common good, just as you said, Joseph.
Yeah. Be nice to have a good king. And not a bad one.
Keep it if you can.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Well, then let's start next week with the chapter on the Doctrine of the Two Kingdoms. And that also is going to be a very rich chapter of Augustinian wisdom. All right, thanks everyone. God bless you all, and see you next week.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.